During our prolonged cold snap here in Alberta, we received an emergency alert to our phones, warning us to limit our electricity use to avoid a grid failure. Now, the NDP are blaming the uncouth voting habits of the unwashed masses, but I'm blaming the NDP. And I called a grid watcher to explain. Cold weather, even sub minus 40 degrees Celsius weather, well, it's absolutely nothing unseasonable for us here in Alberta. This extreme cold snap that we're living through right now is lasting a little longer than usual. But last weekend, Albertans received this message to our phones from the provincial government, Amber Alert style. This is an Alberta emergency alert issued by the AEMA. This alert is in effect for Alberta. Extreme cold resulting in high power demand has placed the Alberta grid at high risk of rotating power outages this evening. Albertans are asked to immediately limit their electricity use to essential needs only, turn off unnecessary lights and electrical appliances, minimize the use of space heaters, delay use of major power appliances, delay charging electrical vehicles, and plugging in block heaters. Cook with microwave instead of stove. For more information, visit the Alberta Electric System Operator website. Now, how could this place where I live, so rich in natural resources and fossil fuels and energy, be running out of electricity? Well, the Socialists, New Democrats are blaming the current government. Actually, they're not really blaming the current government. They're blaming the blue-collar underclass for voting for the current government. Look at this tweet here from Brian Mason. He's the former leader of the Alberta New Democrats prior to current, now also resigned leader Rachel Notley. He says, "What's changed? You hillbillies elected Danielle Smith and the UCP. That's what's changed."
The NDP Trudeau carbon tax on the farmer who grows the food and the trucker who ships the food is a tax on all who buy the food.
Now they want to quadruple the tax.
I'm Pierre Poilievre. I'll axe the tax so you pay less and bring home more.
So who's really to blame for why Alberta, rich with 800 years of clean-burning coal under our feet, is running out of electricity? Is the current government to blame for not being prepared for a cold snap? Or is it the useful people of the world who make, grow, move, build, and fix everything, as the former leader of the NDP, Brian Mason, would have us believe? Or is it the NDP themselves who forced an accelerated coal phase-out on Alberta's electricity grid? My friend Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science wrote an op-ed very recently in the Western Standard explaining how we got ourselves here in an energy crisis in Alberta. Joining me now is Michelle Stirling to break down the crisis in Alberta's electrical grid. Take a listen.
Well, the main problem is that under the NDP, coal was phased out entirely in Canada and in Alberta, and early. So the original legislation under the Harper government was that the newest coal plants which are low emissions, high efficiency plants, would be able to run until the end of their useful life, which would be 2060. And by 2030, all the older coal plants would go offline. But under Notley, all of the coal plants were forced to shut down, and early, and she instituted a carbon tax, which made all of the coal operators dump their licenses back into the balancing pool, which was running a huge multi-billion-dollar tab. But the point is really that coal phase-out happened too fast, and it happened for all of the coal. So now we have a lapse in energy security, because before we used to have about 45% natural gas on the grid and 45% coal. And coal is a very reliable producer of electricity and usually used for what's called baseload, meaning that throughout the day and night, there's always a certain amount of power that is required for everything. So coal was phased out too rapidly. And because of the uncertainties in legislation, the building of new natural gas plants was delayed, partly because of the desire for investors and operators to know what would be the compensation, would it be fair or not, and partly because these things simply take a long time to get going. It takes, 10 to 20 years to build a new plant, and they cost billions of dollars. So we had to pay billions for coal phase out, and then now we are also paying for new generation. Now, what's happened is that we're really short on what's called dispatchable power. So with coal or natural gas plants, especially natural gas, you can ramp it up or down as you need. Coal plants generally can't be ramped up much, but they can run consistently and make that baseline. But now we don't have that coal baseline, except for 2 plants, which are running flat out all the time. And with natural gas, we don't have the additional capacity added. At the same time, in the interim, we have added 4,500 megawatts of renewable power to the grid. So when you look at the bottom of the ISO chart, the Alberta Electric System Operator chart, it looks like we have thousands of megawatts of power just waiting to be used. But what happened is when this polar vortex moved in, all the wind died completely. I can send you a link to windy.com, and you can just see the image of this whoosh, abyss of no wind all across Alberta. So the polar vortex, the temperature dropped, the wind stopped, the sun went down. So wind and solar, which make up now about 6,120, I think it is, megawatts in the grid. 6,000 megawatts vanished at sundown. And at the same time, it was horribly cold, deathly cold, minus 40s and 50s. And people, of course, wanted to keep warm, keep their lights on. It's all at peak time, when people come home from work, when they're doing laundry, when they're doing dishes, when they're getting kids
Plugging
ready
in their
for school.
vehicles.
Yeah, plugging in their car, their block heater, their EV, whatever. So, the thing is, this is extremely variable demand that happens. And you can see it graphed on the Alberta Electric System Operator every day that, about 4 o'clock, the demand goes up and then drops off again. So all these things combined, along with the fact that we have about 1 million more people in Alberta. So we have less dispatchable power than we had actually. Well, we may be at balance right now, but at one point when I did the video on Alberta's moratorium on renewables, we had less dispatchable power in Alberta, 1,000 megawatts less than we had in 2014. And we had many more renewables. So, when renewables go AWOL, you can't count on them anymore. And so the system has to try and make up that demand. And electricity, people talk about storage, let's have more batteries, it would solve everything. Batteries don't generate power, they can only store it. So most of the batteries that we have on the system right now, can provide a bit of power for an hour, maybe 3 hours, but it's a very limited time span. And these things cost a fortune and must be replaced every 10 years. So that's not a solution. It's useful for load shedding, meaning, when there is a sudden surge or drop in power, these can be quite useful. And it is a way to store wind. When there's lots of wind, you can charge up the battery, or lots of solar. But it's not the answer. It cannot generate power. So these were the complications that we were facing. I think the Alberta Electric System Operator did very well. I mean, on Saturday night, I think we were at 0 megawatts of reserve capacity. Oh, because that's the other thing. You can read the 2022 market statistics report from the Alberta Electric System Operator, and you can see that our reserve capacity in the grid in Alberta is about half what it was back in the time when we had the coal plants online. And where do we get our excess reserve capacity now? From Saskatchewan, from Montana, from BC. But only, if they have the spare capacity to send us. And of course, like the interties, people keep talking like, why don't we build up the interties and then everything would be solved? Why don't we make a national power grid? Everything would be solved. That's not true, because there's a huge line loss in a national power grid. That would probably put us at risk of national blackouts. But the other thing is the interties have limited capacity. to bring power from another province for various technical reasons that I cannot explain to you. And another thing I wanted to mention, a couple of the natural gas plants did go offline. I'm not sure if it was scheduled maintenance or, sometimes these things also fail in these extreme conditions, but they were back up pretty soon. But people were saying, oh, it's economic withholding. They're holding back the power just to drive the price up. Well, I did talk with some professional engineers who work in the Alberta system, and I asked them about this. And they said, look, economic withholding is a method, a perfectly legal method of setting prices in the pool, because we have a market-driven system in Alberta, which is completely different than the rest of Canada. But physical withholding is something else. So in economic withholding, you can imagine that sort of like as bidding or bartering, maybe at at an auction or something, if you like, to make it very simple. So there's nothing illegal about, demanding a higher price or bidding for a higher price. The ISO will always take the lowest price available first, and then will go on a merit order. But physical withholding, meaning that you shut down your plant or constrain your supply to the grid, is illegal. And the fines are extremely large, like I think it's $3 million a day. And there may be other sanctions attached to it. And if you look back to 2015, TransAlta was charged with physical withholding, and I think they were fined $56 million. So, that's not what was happening over the weekend. And I think even Brian Mason was saying things like that it was economic withholding, and they're confusing the terms. And also, there were a number of armchair experts online all of a sudden. I suppose I could put myself somewhat in that category because I'm not an engineer, but I do consult with professional engineers. But some people were saying, look at the Alberta Electric System Operator. If you look under TNG, those are the natural gas plants. Well, no, TNG means total net generation. So, and they were saying, look, these plants are not online. Some of the things they were saying was that the cogeneration plants were not putting out enough because there were zeros in the dispatchable reserve. Well, for instance, the University of Calgary and the University of Edmonton both provide co-generated power to the grid. So they have a natural gas plant that heats their building, and the waste heat of that is used to run an electrical generator, which supplies some power back to the grid. But you can't go to the University of Calgary or Edmonton and say, would you turn up your heat a little bit so we can have a bit more power? So this waste heat, this cogen, is very important because it provides very consistent baseload. But again, it's not dispatchable power.
Now, the NDP and the Liberal coalition, which governed Alberta for 4 dark, expensive years, they made a conscious policy effort to get Alberta off coal, as you rightly point out, and get Alberta off coal jobs. However, in times like these, Alberta is not off coal, and we are not off coal jobs. We're just off Alberta coal and Alberta coal jobs, because ultimately our shortfall will be made up by Montana and Wyoming and Saskatchewan, which also uses coal-fired generation and sells the excess sometimes at a premium because we're all experiencing the same cold snap to us.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's the oxymoron. People keep saying that coal is going away and the world will be running on renewables. And you can see, if you look at our world in data, that coal use around the world is simply expanding. You can see in Germany, which is suffering greatly because, of course, Nord Stream gas pipeline was blown up, and the conflict in Ukraine and Russia has decimated their natural gas supply. They're using coal. In the UK, they had to start up an old coal plant again. So coal is cheap, it's reliable, it's affordable, it's price stable. That's the other thing that's very important, because natural gas is a market commodity. So internationally, the prices can jump overnight a huge amount, especially like in times of a cold snap. But coal is really like pretty price stable around the world. I think during lockdowns or post lockdowns, it went up a bit, uh, but it's a very stable price consideration. And energy security, you need to have options. And one of those for Alberta should be coal. One of the things I think it's important for the public to know is that during the whole discussion about coal phase out, we did about 10 different reports. And I think actually I'll post them all on our blog in a list so people can see them, telling people of the risks. But because of the media lockout in the mainstream media, they wouldn't even report on any of our reports, and therefore the public was not well informed about the consequences of coal phase out. So I'll send you a list of those, and you can put the covers up. And you can see from 2013, and also we brought Dr. Benny Pizer from the UK to talk about the to heat or to eat, Europe's climate policy fiasco, to try and warn people. He was here in 2013. We tried.
The accelerated coal phase out here in Alberta is just another feature of how the Green Left seeks to control your life. To sign the Rebel News petition against these power-hungry control freaks, go to nogreenreset.com.